Kirk to Rayborn, report. I'm required to make a security confirmation. When I call my ship, if you list your personnel, cargo requirements, any special needs.
Imagine spending years as a devoted fan of one of television's greatest science fiction franchises, only to discover that your national broadcaster had quietly decided you weren't allowed to watch certain episodes. No announcement. No public debate. Just a deliberate, top-level decision made behind closed doors to keep specific stories off the air. That is exactly what happened to Star Trek fans in the United Kingdom for decades, and when the full story behind those bans finally came to light, it was every bit as dramatic as anything the show itself had put on screen. What the BBC found so disturbing that it refused to air these episodes for years wasn't alien invasion or time travel paradoxes. It was something far more visceral, far more psychological, and in some cases, far more human than anyone expected from a science fiction series set in the distant future. These weren't small controversies quietly forgotten. They involved formal written statements from broadcasting executives, petitions from fans, and in one case, a wait of nearly 3 decades before UK audiences were finally allowed to see what all the fuss was about. So let's go through the Star Trek episodes that were banned, understand exactly why they triggered such extreme reactions, and explore the full, fascinating, and sometimes bizarre story behind each one. To understand why these bans felt so significant, it helps to know just how dominant the BBC was as a gatekeeper of television content in the United Kingdom for much of the 20th century. When Star Trek first began airing in Britain on BBC One on July 12, 1969, with the episode Where No Man Has Gone Before, it was largely classified as a program suitable for younger viewers. That designation turned out to be consequential. Because the BBC considered Star Trek in part a children's show, its standards for acceptable content were far stricter than they would have been for adult programming. Repeats were rare, VHS tapes were expensive, and until satellite broadcaster Sky One began airing the complete series in 1990, the BBC was essentially the only accessible way most British fans could watch the show. That gave the corporation enormous power over what audiences were permitted to see, and they were not shy about using it. The first episode to fall victim to the BBC's editorial judgment was Miri, the 8th episode of the original series' first season. It aired once in the United Kingdom in December of 1970, and the response it generated was unlike anything the broadcaster had anticipated. The BBC received an unusually large number of complaints following that single airing, enough to trigger a formal review of the episode's suitability. What had disturbed viewers so deeply? The story centers on Captain Kirk leading a landing party to a planet that appears identical to Earth, only to find it abandoned and frozen in time. The silence doesn't last. They soon discover a community of children who refer to themselves as the Oneless, the only survivors after a catastrophic plague wiped out every adult. These children, it turns out, are centuries old due to a failed life extension experiment, but they still think and feel exactly like normal kids. When the plague begins spreading to the adult members of the crew, marking their skin and beginning the slow descent toward madness, the episode takes on a genuinely dark and unsettling tone. What made Miri so hard to shake wasn't graphic violence in the traditional sense. It was the emotional devastation lurking beneath every scene. The sight of children who had survived alone for 300 years, growing increasingly feral out of fear and grief, while adult members of the Enterprise crew slowly lost their minds to a disease they couldn't yet cure, created a kind of despair that the BBC felt was simply too distressing for its audience. Following the broadcast complaints, the corporation quietly removed Miri from all future repeat schedules. It would not air again on BBC television for more than 20 years. When UK fans wrote in throughout the 1970s and 1980s demanding to know why, they received a stock reply that became infamous among devotees of the show. The BBC had decided not to screen certain episodes because they dealt, in the corporation's own words, most unpleasantly with the already unpleasant subjects of madness, torture, sadism, and disease. That single sentence applied not just to Miri but to 3 other original series episodes that received the same fate, forming what became known among fans as the 4 banned Star Trek episodes in the United Kingdom. The second episode on that list was Plato's Stepchildren, the 10th episode of the original series' 3rd season, which first aired in the United States on November 22, 1968. This episode carries an extraordinary historical distinction in the story of American television. During the story, Captain Kirk, Spock, and Dr. McCoy beam down to answer a distress call, where they find a society of powerful hedonists who model themselves on ancient Greek philosophers. These beings, called Platonians, possess psychic abilities that allow them to control the physical actions of others against their will. For their own amusement, they force Kirk and Uhura toward each other, compelling them to share what became widely recognized as one of the earliest instances of an interracial kiss between a black woman and a white man on American primetime television. The moment was brief, but its cultural weight was enormous. NBC had worried intensely that the scene would provoke a backlash from Southern television stations, and the network was so anxious about the reaction that producer William Shatner recalled in his memoir Star Trek Memories, that NBC reportedly insisted their lips never actually touch on camera. Nichelle Nichols, however, maintained in her autobiography Beyond Uhura that the kiss was real. Whatever the technical truth, what happened next surprised almost everyone. Almost no formal complaints arrived. Nichols herself later recalled that the episode received a huge response, with the cast receiving some of the largest volumes of fan mail they had ever seen, the overwhelming majority of it positive. As for the one dissenting letter that has since become legendary, it came from a single viewer in the South who wrote that while he opposed racial mixing, anytime a man like Kirk had a woman like Uhura in his arms, he wasn't going to fight it. That was the sum total of the Southern outrage NBC had feared. In the United Kingdom, however, the episode never aired at all on the BBC. The reason had nothing to do with the kiss. British censors were far more troubled by the sustained cruelty of the Platonians, who used their powers to humiliate and torment the Enterprise crew in deeply sadistic ways. Forcing human beings to act against their will, to degrade themselves for the entertainment of others, to weep while their captors laughed, represented a kind of psychological brutality that the BBC felt was inappropriate for family television. 4 decades after, a persistent rumor circulated that the episode had been banned in the American South due to the kiss. That rumor was false. No such ban was ever enacted in the United States. The BBC's decision had an entirely different basis, and it kept one of the most historically significant episodes in Star Trek history off British screens for years. The third episode caught in the same sweep of BBC censorship was Whom Gods Destroy, from the original series' 3rd season. The premise places Kirk and Spock on a routine medical delivery run to a high-security psychiatric facility on the remote planet Elba II, which houses the Federation's most dangerous and criminally disturbed individuals. What should have been a straightforward assignment collapses almost immediately when they arrive to find that the patients have seized control of the facility. Their leader is Garth of Izar, once a celebrated Starfleet captain known for extraordinary tactical brilliance and courage, now completely unhinged and convinced he is destined to conquer the galaxy. His most terrifying capability is the power to physically reshape himself into the exact likeness of any person, making him not just dangerous but genuinely impossible to identify with certainty. When Garth kills a fellow patient on a whim simply to demonstrate his power over life and death, the episode becomes something altogether darker than a standard adventure. The BBC's decision to keep this episode off the air was connected to multiple concerns. There was the violence and the atmosphere of psychological chaos that the episode sustained throughout. But there was also a more surprising element. Actress Yvonne Craig appeared in the episode as Marta, an Orion woman held in the facility, and her performance included a dance scene that British censors considered too sexually suggestive for children's television. The combination of sadistic violence, mental instability, and content deemed inappropriate for younger viewers was enough to seal the episode's fate alongside the other 3. Whom Gods Destroy did not air on BBC television until 1994, the same year the corporation finally relented on all 4 of its long-banned original series episodes. The 4th episode the BBC refused to broadcast for decades was The Empath, from the 3rd season of the original series. Where the other 3 banned episodes had generated complaints or obvious concerns about specific scenes, The Empath was pulled for reasons that were more psychological than visual. The story follows the crew as they become subjects of torturous experiments conducted by alien beings on a doomed world. The suffering inflicted on the characters is largely implied rather than shown directly, conveyed through the reactions of the crew and the descriptions spoken aloud, which allowed viewers' imaginations to fill in the horrifying details far more effectively than any special effect of the era could have achieved. The BBC concluded that the episode's exploration of what it called madness, torture, sadism, and disease crossed lines it was not willing to risk on public television, particularly given its young audience base. While British fans could not see these episodes on television, they did eventually become available on rental VHS tapes in the early 1980s through the distributor CIC Video, which released Miri and The Empath as a rental pair, followed by Plato's Stepchildren and Whom Gods Destroy on a second tape. When British fans wrote to the BBC demanding the broadcast ban be lifted, they received increasingly firm refusals. A statement released in August 1979 informed fans that the BBC had no plans to show the banned episodes, and that the corporation's decision, made after very careful consideration, was in the best interest of viewers in this country. A further response in the mid-1980s acknowledged that many of the show's enthusiastic followers were juveniles, and that airing the episodes at a later hour would not resolve the problem because the large juvenile fan base would find ways to watch regardless of scheduling. It wasn't until Sky One began airing the complete series in 1990 that British audiences could watch all 4 episodes freely. The BBC finally lifted its restrictions in 1994, nearly a quarter-century after the original ban began. The original series was not the only chapter of the Star Trek franchise to run into serious broadcast difficulties. When Star Trek: The Next Generation arrived in 1987, it brought with it a new cast, a new ship, and a generally more hopeful and diplomatically optimistic tone than its predecessor. But in its first season, one episode broke so sharply from that optimism that it shocked even its own producers. Conspiracy, the 25th and penultimate episode of The Next Generation's first season, aired in the United States on May 9, 1988. The story had originally been conceived by writer Tracy Torm as a tale of an actual military coup within Starfleet Command, which Gene Roddenberry rejected outright because he refused to believe that 24th century humans could organize such a betrayal. The compromise that emerged replaced the human conspirators with parasitic aliens, brain-controlling creatures that could enter a host's body and take complete command of their actions. The episode builds methodically toward a confrontation between Captain Picard, Commander Riker, and the officer harboring the parasite queen, a character named Lieutenant Commander Dexter Remick. When they open fire on him, what follows is the single most graphic moment in the entire history of The Next Generation, and arguably one of the most viscerally shocking scenes in all of Star Trek. Remick's head explodes on camera. The effect was achieved by constructing a model of a human head packed with raw meat, which was then detonated live on set, sending fragments everywhere. The explosion was followed by a further reveal, a large alien parasite creature forcing its way out of what remained of the character's chest cavity. The makeup and effects team's work on the episode earned the show one of its 3 Emmy Awards that season for outstanding achievement in makeup, which created a certain irony given the restrictions the episode simultaneously provoked. Producers Rick Berman and Peter Lauritsen had their own concerns about whether the scene was too graphic for a mainstream audience. According to the 1997 book Star Trek: The Next Generation, the continuing mission by Judith and Garfield Reeve-Stevens, the producers resolved their uncertainty by showing the episode to the 6-year-old son of special effects supervisor Dan Curry. The boy's response was immediate enthusiasm, and he suggested manufacturing a Remick action figure with a button-activated exploding head. That was apparently sufficient reassurance for the producers to leave the scene intact for American audiences. Canadian broadcasters aired the episode with a content warning attached. The BBC took a much more decisive approach and refused to air the episode at all. When it finally did appear on British television, broadcast on BBC Two rather than the main channel, the climactic head explosion scene had been substantially edited down, removing the moment viewers in every other country had found so memorably disturbing. The episode's unresolved ending, in which a mysterious parasite signal is transmitted deep into space alerting other hive colonies to a conflict with humanoids, was never followed up in any on-screen episode of The Next Generation, leaving British viewers who saw only the edited version even further removed from the full dramatic impact the story had intended. What all of these banned and censored episodes share, beyond the surface-level specifics of their content, is something more revealing about Star Trek itself. Gene Roddenberry built the franchise on the principle that science fiction could carry social commentary that would be impossible to deliver directly through conventional drama. By wrapping controversial ideas inside alien settings and futuristic conflicts, the show could address real human fears, real social injustices, and real psychological darkness in ways that made audiences feel them more acutely rather than less. The episodes that got banned were the ones where that darkness was pushed to its furthest edge, where the metaphor dropped away and something raw and uncomfortable stood in plain sight. A disease that transforms adults into violent, dying creatures while children watched helplessly. A society of beings who used mental control to destroy people's dignity for entertainment. A man whose brilliant mind had completely collapsed into murderous grandiosity. A parasite that reduced human identity to nothing more than a hollow, discarded shell. Broadcasters who banned these episodes were not wrong to recognize that the content was genuinely difficult. But they were making a judgment that their audiences, and particularly younger members of those audiences, needed to be shielded from that difficulty. What the enduring passion of Star Trek fans suggests, and what the franchise's remarkable cultural legacy across nearly 6 decades confirms, is that audiences often want to be challenged rather than protected. The very qualities that made the BBC reach for the off switch, the willingness to depict madness honestly, to show cruelty without softening it, to let the horror of a parasite taking over a human body be felt in full, were the same qualities that kept fans fighting for years to see what they had been told they were not ready to handle. When those 4 original series episodes finally aired on the BBC in 1994, and when the edited version of Conspiracy eventually reached British screens, those decades of anticipation had turned each one into something more than just a television episode. They had become symbols of everything Star Trek had always represented: the belief that stories should go further, ask harder questions, and refuse to look away from the uncomfortable truths that define what it means to be human, even when the human in question is being played by someone with pointed ears or a parasite